in the acknowledgements of my recently published book, I start with the famous statement by the French painter Philippe Guston, who said that every time he started a painting, he felt as though there were many people in the room with him. And as he progressed to something true, one by one, each of them left the room. And then, when he was truly done with the painting, he himself left the room. Today, I will present to you, in the spirit of my profession, I'm a historian, as was pointed out, the stories of women in history who, in their unusual lives and choices, have made many things possible for Indian women like me. It is these women and many others whom I think haunt our everyday. Each of them has been an astra for other women in her own right. My own journey in scholarship began when I was quite young. I was interested in many things, but I was lucky enough to be most interested in a very traditional discipline called history. Initially, it was things like, ancient Egypt and pyramids and various stories, spectacular stories from history, and then it was women in history, and then eventually Buddhism, which is the subject of my first book. I was encouraged to follow my interests and read and write as much as I liked. As a middle class, school going urban girl of the 90s, I could take school entirely for granted. But we know that it wasn't always like this, and that it's still not always like this. And for inspiration, we have women like Roshundari Devi, who in 19th century Bengal was married at the age of 12, sent off to a place far away from her childhood home and from her mother for whom she pined, at a time when illiteracy for upper caste and upper class girls was the norm. But she dreamed of reading the Chaitanya Bhagavat and other sacred texts, and she never gave up on that dream. So, despite her crippling household responsibilities, including the care of 11 children, she taught herself how to read from the age of 25. And then she stole palm leaves from her young son's language practice to practice letters on the soot on her kitchen walls, in secret, of course. So good did she get at this that she eventually published the very first autobiography in Bengali called Amar Jibon, or My Life. Now, without great teachers, I think my life and scholarship would have hit a roadblock a long time ago. And the really great teachers all know that teaching is always at least partly a service. Let's remember here what the late sociologist J.P.S. Oberoi apparently once said. The priests, soldiers, and teachers never get paid exactly what they deserve because their impact is so indeterminable. Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain, an early 20th century radical writer, is actually quite well known for her novel Sultana's Dream, in which she envisaged a world in which men were behind parda. What is less well known is that she was a teacher, and she started a school when she was in Calcutta in 1911 with just 8 students. She was undaunted by this low enrollment, and she worked night and day to make a success of the school, all the while continuing quite radical writing about women's education and women's rights and participating in women's organizations. In 1997, in the 50th year of India's independence, I joined Lady Shriram College for an undergraduate degree in history. I was transformed by then, or on the way anyway, to being transformed into the proverbial angry young woman. It was the end of the 90s. It felt like everything had changed. There were a series of coalition governments at the center, the top of that decade. And then there was economic liberalization and the implementation of the Mandal Commission reforms, the demolition of the Babri Masjid, and so much more. Change was in the air, and people were angry that it wasn't happening fast enough. I still remember being told by one of my teachers at Jawaharlal Nehru University, where I joined for my master's degree, that my anger at a fellow student who openly spouted regressive ideas about women's place in society was not useful. But you and I know that without angry young women, we would not have the powerful critiques of gender roles that have made it possible for so many of us to challenge them or even break them. In the late 19th century, a Maharashtrian woman named Tarabai Shinde was absolutely enraged. A young widow was being tried for the murder of her newborn baby, and the ensuing public debate veered between a majority who felt that she ought to be punished for breaking the rules of enforced widowhood, like having sex, and a minority that argued that her predicament should be viewed sympathetically, given the systemic injustice that all child widows faced and the fact that they're forced to live this life without any pleasure at all. So Tarabai wrote an impassioned essay called Stri Purush Tulna, a comparison between woman and man, exposing the hypocrisy of attitudes towards women. Dripping with sarcasm and rage, she thundered in words on a page. I'm sure there are very few men who have been ruined by women, but it would be difficult even to guess at the number of women who've been ruined by men. You are nothing but scoundrels of the first order. And when it comes to angry women on the subcontinent, well, we have many ghosts with us. There were the revolutionary women, Preeti Lata Vadedar, Bikaji Kama, Kalpana Dutt, Lakshmi Sehgal, or the women of the Telangana armed struggle, or Nakshalbari, or even the fictional Dopti of Mahashweta Devi's marvelous short story. But while I was at LSR, and later at JNU, I understood how important women's solidarity was to moving society forward. And I believe the support of my women friends and the many conversations I've had over the years with them has been crucial in my life. And here I think back to the story of the 19th century widow Chandra, who died after a botched abortion. The story was recounted with great care by the late historian Ranajit Guha. In the few fragments left of the case, in which her mother and her sister were blamed for her death, he resurrects her experience in history and argues that though she died, she was part of a resistance to dominant forces, however slight, however failed. That resistance was carried out in solidarity with other women who wished for her to take her place in society rather than be cast out, however risky this proposition was. There are, of course, many other examples of solidarity, the numerous women's organizations, associations, conferences that have continued to advocate for the cause of women around India over the last 150 years. And as part of the research for my recent book, I looked at a work, a wonderful work about Dalit women's collective efforts in the Ambedkarite movement from the 1930s onwards. This was written by Urmila Pawar and Meenakshi Moon. It's evocatively called We Also Made History. By the time I was done with Oxford and back in Delhi, I was ready to give academics a break and to work. And so I was fortunate enough to get a job at the National Mission for Manuscripts, which was a Department of Culture project. And the job involved traveling around the country, trying to persuade bureaucrats and repository managers and librarians to document their holdings and then share all of that on a common database. I often despaired at the refusal of many of these stakeholders to cooperate with a young woman, I was young then, who was not married and therefore not respectable enough. And let me again emphasize, too young. I wondered if all this effort was worth it. And it was at times like those that I thought back to the women that I'd read about with missions of their own. Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay in 1944 delivered a very significant presidential address, which I think is still relevant, at the All India Women's Congress annual meeting after being released from jail, where she had been since the start of the Quit India movement in 1942. She reminded us that in catering to the daily needs of life, it was important that the cultural side not be neglected. So, to quote her, the delicate creations in words, song, and color in which the dreams of humankind find expression must be nurtured and fostered. We know that her remarkable efforts after 1947 in the arena of reviving and popularizing handicrafts and ensuring the dignity of the labor of craftsmen and women has had an enduring impact. But there was another side to my work at the National Mission for Manuscripts, and that was the sheer adventure of it. I traveled all over the country in trains and buses and cars at the time, and other interesting vehicles. And this was the early 2000s when such solo travel by a woman, even for work, was not the norm. Here too, I had important predecessors. And I think of Homi Vairawala, who lived the most extraordinary life. As the first woman photojournalist in India, she was everywhere, photographing everyone, all the big political figures of the day, as well as ordinary people, from the time she began that work in the early 1940s to the time she retired in 1970. She apparently would don her sari, strap on her camera, get on a cycle, and cycle to all her different assignments. And she must have been a very unusual sight. When I left for Harvard for my doctoral studies in 2006, once again, it was no longer out of the ordinary for women to go abroad for a higher degree or a professional degree. And here I think about Pandita Ramabai, who was highly educated and a wanderer and a reformer and a mother, who traveled to England for a degree in medicine in the late 19th century. While there, she did the unthinkable and converted to Christianity for spiritual reasons. So, ever the rebel, ever the deep thinker. A few years later, she visited the United States, where she witnessed the graduation of her cousin, Anindi Bai Joshi, who became the first Indian woman physician. or at least one of the first. And then there was Cornelia Sorabji, the very first woman in Oxford to read law in the 1890s. When she got there, she was told, no way, you can't study law. But she had some supporters and she had some benefactors and she kept pushing at it. And eventually she got her degree. But it was to be another 30 years, only in 1923, when women were allowed, or rather admitted to the bar. And that was when she was admitted to the bar. So a full 30 years after that degree. In 2012, Nirbhaya was gang raped and left for dead in Delhi. For many women, including me, it was a reminder of the many instances of violence that women face on an everyday basis. Besides Nirbhaya herself, who remained, as we all know, defiant till the end, women in India have been fighting all kinds of violence, from the everyday, on the streets, at home, in workplaces, in communities. And here I think of Mathura, I think of Bhavari Devi, I think of Bilkis Bano, just to name a few whose fight for justice has, shook the conscience of the nation. And then there was Dakshayani Veludan, one of the very few women and the only Dalit woman in the Constituent Assembly of India who faced caste discrimination and violence all her life, at least all her early life. But she refused to be daunted, got her education, and stood for elections. And as a member of the Constituent Assembly, she delivered a fiery speech in which she argued passionately for what was to become a key article in the Constitution, which banned untouchability and its practice in any form. She was bold and independent enough in her thinking that she also criticized the first draft of the Constitution when it was presented by the drafting committee in November 1948. She thought the state was envisioned as too centralized. She suggested that it be put to a vote by the people. That's how far she went. So she was a woman clearly well ahead of her times. In 2013, I had the first of my two children. That year, I was awarded my doctorate. I also started working at Jindal Global Law School, my first proper academic job. So it was a huge year for me. And I had a complex relationship with motherhood at the time. I didn't think I was doing anything particularly original in becoming a mother. In fact, it was expected of most of us. An ideology of motherhood, which suggests that women are in effect the mothers of the nation and must follow certain compulsions and injunctions around it, was as old as anti colonial nationalism was itself. That notion of motherhood didn't appeal to me. But I was equally uncomfortable with what some of my friends and acquaintances were suggesting, that they were writers, activists, academics first, and mothers second. The very binary between motherhood and intellectual activity seemed false or tenuous at best, and it was akin to all those other binaries through which we have to work, a gift of colonial modernity, like man, woman, tradition, modernity, religion, rationality, all set up in stark opposition and aggressive opposition. Some of these issues became especially acute for me when the pandemic struck, and I was overwhelmed by the care of two small children who seemed to have an interminable break from school, the care of elders, of myself and my husband, all while witnessing the numerous horrors that were unfolding around us, including the largest migration of people after the partition of India. The photos of entire families of all ages making the long journey back in the dead of summer on foot to their rural homes will stay with me forever. Now, the urge and desire to actually do something more was trumped, obviously, by the requirements of domestic care and the sheer uncertainty of this thing called COVID 19. The days passed in cooking, cleaning, online schoolings, and small childcare. And then there were my husband's never ending work from home meetings. And then later there were my own teaching commitments online. It felt like drudgery without an end in sight. And then I read in P. Sainath's remarkable book, The Remarkable Story of Bhabani Mahato, who was married at 9 and lived till 104. And from the moment she was married, she fed and cared for a very large family. When her husband was jailed for revolutionary activity in the 1940s, she sent food for him and his cellmates. When he came out and continued to meet his friends in the revolutionary underground, she was once again feeding a very large cohort of people, much larger than her family. She not only tilled the fields, after all, someone had to do that labor, she also had to gather the food that then she would cook for all these people. Did she gain recognition as a freedom fighter? No. Her labor was made invisible by a society that only recognized visible political participation, that too of men. Was that political participation even possible without women like her? Also, no. In that same 1944 address, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay points out that tradition tends to place a lower value on women's work at home. The non pecuniary and non competitive nature of her work makes it apparently less important than that of the husband who's bringing home the paycheck. And then, to use her exact words, she called this antisocial in every way. Years later, the famous black poet Audre Lorde reminded us that the very humanity of people, especially women of color, is called into question when everything that is good and necessary is defined in terms of profit alone. More recently, there's been talk of the notorious double burden, where women work for a paycheck but then continue to do most of their work at home. And then there's the additional issue of the enormous informal sector women employed as cooks and cleaners and nannies who are frequently paid less than the minimum wage and on whom we all depend. Here I think of baby Haldar, who was married as a child to an abusive man, whom she left to work as a domestic help in Gurgaon. With fearless clarity and honesty, she recalls her struggle as a single mother, dealing with exploitative employers and job insecurity and enormous burden of work. Still, her passion for reading and writing led her to write this memoir. She kept her rich inner life going, and she remains inspirational. Practically speaking, after much writing and more than a decade of teaching, I continue to grapple with the demands of teaching, demands of the everyday and the demands of a life of the mind. It's at moments like this that I think of the wild women and women seekers that our subcontinent has produced, and it gives me solace. Lal Ded, the 14th century Kashmiri mystic, who said, "Alone I cross the field of emptiness." Mirabai, the 16th century mystic, who said, "My hairs come loose. I dance like a madwoman." Or Muta, a Buddhist nun who said in the Therigatha, "So freed, so thoroughly freed am I." Or Piro, the 19th century mystic, who said, "Let us go where the mendicants live. Come, Piro." As Arundhati Subramaniam beautifully put it recently, for women in India, having an inner life is a delicate dance between surrender and sovereignty. I'm a woman of privilege, and yet every one of these women, all that they have said, all that they have done, has been of relevance to me and my journey. And I'll leave you with one final thought. I sometimes wonder what our society, our institutions, our place of work, our places of study, would indeed our world would look like if instead of profit, we privilege nurture as an important value derived from that large basket of undervalued feminine values. The efforts of all these women have allowed me to dream of such a world. So, for all these reasons, these women are my astras, and because they were, I am. Thank you.